Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We do have a comment to read from our latest short from the username at Dick Rickless. He's been saying, he said on our short, he's been saying Spider Mitchell for MVP. I personally don't agree with him being the MVP, and even in the game that we talked about in our short, he didn't play up to standards, but I don't think you can really, take anything away from his performance on the season. I think he's been playing out of his mind. He's definitely one of the huge catalysts for why the Cavs has had so much success, obviously, alongside the other guys like Garland and Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, just collectively a great unit and a great team. But, I think individual success is probably not going to be the highlight of the Cleveland Cavaliers season.
Yeah, I think that's kind of honestly the main point of this, is that, the Cavs have had a great season. He's had a really good season individually.
Mm-hmm.
But just in terms of the MVP award, I just don't think he's going to be able to get it, even with, the record that the Cavs have. I think at this point, SGA is probably the favorite to win it. Just, their record's relatively similar, and his individual stats compared to Mitchell are going to look better. And obviously they haven't had Chet either. So I think he's probably right now the favorite to get it. And I know there's other names like Jokic and Giannis, but I feel like SGA is probably the favorite as of right now. But you can't discount the season Mitchell and the Cavs have had.
Yeah, agreed. And we do appreciate all the recent support and viewership on our content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so the NBA season continues to march on. Obviously, we did have, a few games that were postponed, due to the weather. Obviously, you had the fires in California, and then also you had a couple of games, I believe, that were postponed due to weather elsewhere, right? Like I believe the Rockets and the Hawks, that game was postponed because Atlanta had some bad weather going on. But in terms of some of these NBA games that we did end up having a matchup of, we did have one on Saturday that I thought was kind of a, that I thought was kind of a fun matchup going in. Because you look at the Grizzlies and the Wolves. Obviously, the Wolves have not been that great this season. Pretty easily, I think, the most disappointing team in the league outside of the Suns. But, the Wolves have also been pretty healthy. So, and they were also in the Western Conference Finals. Again, we talked about it where we thought they'd probably take a step back, but not to this degree. But the Grizzlies were, this was a pretty competitive back and forth game. But it's wild because the two stars in this game for most of it were pretty muted, right? I mean, Ja Morant, he made some big buckets at the end, a couple of, clutch drives to the basket, right? But he only finished, with shooting 5 of 19 from the field. He had 12 points, 4 assists, 5 rebounds, 5 turnovers. But obviously, by the end, made a positive impact. The big star was Jaren Jackson Jr., right? Who's continued to have a great season, right? I think he's pretty much on his way to being an all-star this year. Is like if they only get one All-Star, it's probably going to be Triple J. He's been healthy. He's played almost every game, and he's been great. Basically having a career year, kind of figuring out now being able to score both around the basket and obviously, of course, he can shoot the three, right? His post game has continued to improve from what it was. He's got a face-up game as well, so he's pretty much got like a pretty complete package on offense. Still not like a great passer or playmaker, but obviously his offensive game now is just significantly stronger than it was as a younger player, right? So now that makes him a much more dangerous. Desmond Bane has been playing better. They're getting contributions out of a lot of their young guys. Now they've gotten more of their guys back, like Santi Aldama came back from his injury. Brandon Clark as a backup big, he's come back from his injury. So, they're continue to looking better and better. They continue to look better and better. It's just, there's still questions, I think, ultimately, like, what does it look like in the postseason? I think they still have a ton of depth. They're really good on both ends of the floor. Also, health is a question mark, because he's a guy that unfortunately does seem to miss time. But the Grizzlies had actually been playing kind of average the last 10 games. They had basically been playing 500 basketball. Had a couple of weird games, right? A loss to Houston. Obviously you had the win over the Minnesota Timberwolves, but just as a whole, just kind of a weird stretch of games, which is going to happen, to be fair. But just in general, you look at this team, and this was a team that we were high on going into the season, and they started off kind of slow. But, over the course of the season now, they've pretty much gotten themselves into, back into the contender mix, right? Because even like, 2 seasons ago, they lost in the first round, but they were seen as a contending team. And now they're pretty much back in there and they got, a lot of good pieces around them. I do wonder if they make, any moves at the deadline where they maybe consolidate some of that depth and, go out and get like a veteran guy, or just like a better piece to kind of fit in. Or do they just kind of wait on some of these other guys to come back who haven't played much, like a Vince Williams or, like a Marcus Smart or whomever. But, just kind of a wild game, right? Because the Grizzlies offensively, that's kind of been the big boost this year compared to previous years where they were always a really good defensive team. But now this year they got the offense. And, people talk about the sameness of a lot of teams on offense, but they're a team offensively that is pretty different. They don't run a lot of pick and roll. So it's kind of just, a very spread out offensive attack, right? Like you got Jaren Jackson Jr. posting up, or, shooting from the perimeter. Obviously, Ja with his drives, right? Desmond Bane, and, everybody else contributing. So it's a different style. And like I said, I'm curious to see what it looks like, in the postseason. And also, this was kind of a cool matchup because, Anthony Edwards, right, has kind of been the guy that most people feel like, the last few seasons has kind of moved ahead of where Ja is. But unfortunately for Edwards, his team has taken a major step back this season, and they've been good. They've mentioned in crunch time they were, I think, going into this game 7-3, in the last few minutes, in games decided in the last few minutes. But you can just kind of see at the end of the game, you can just see kind of the problems where, like in the postseason, it's going to be an issue where you just don't have enough floor spacing and reliable shooting out there. As we mentioned, they changed that starting five where Mike Conley's coming off the bench. And DiVincenzo's the guy that's starting now. And this was actually one of their best offensive performances where everybody pretty much, aside from Edwards, played well on offense. And it still wasn't enough. They were getting out-rebounded at different points. So it's just pretty disappointing. But, for Memphis, right, a good bounce-back performance as they continue to kind of try to stake their claim as a legitimate contender in the West.
Yeah, I thought the interesting thing going into this game was, the highlight of the duel between Anthony Edwards and Ja Morant, which we kind of really didn't get, in my opinion. I don't think we got, like, the best version of what that could have been because both guys really didn't play all that great. Ja Morant obviously had the amazing floater and stuff like that, but, the majority of the game, this was really about team ball and, the surrounding pieces and the supporting cast, and I think that was really cool to kind of see that take a turn, and like you said, Memphis has been like stellar on both ends of the floor, and I think that's the big surprise. Whereas, like you said, Minnesota has kind of struggled on both ends of the floor, in my opinion. So I think it's not the Minnesota from last year, so we already know that we can throw that out of the window. And this is not the Memphis from last year either. So these are very different teams right now, and I think it's so cool that Memphis can really just dig deep into their rotation and pull guys out of a freaking hat, and all of a sudden they're all balling. So that's really awesome to see. And collectively, yeah, they're a scary team. I don't know what it's going to look like in the postseason. I feel like how far they go is probably going to be depending on who they play and who they match up against. Because I think they match up against certain teams pretty well, but others not so much. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. But I think it does spark somewhat of like, not like a debate, but a mini conversation of like, who is better between Anthony Edwards or Ja Morant, but like, or maybe like, who are you higher on at the moment? I would probably say Anthony Edwards just because I think he's, like the guy has freak athleticism, but is also like leading the league in 3-point percentage. So it's like, we already know what he can do. And I think, the cool thing is we also don't know what he can do because he has so much potential, and we know that he can elevate beyond that as more than just a jump shooter or a freak athlete, but also a cool playmaker.
Yeah, I think the thing with Ja is the injuries have kind of been the main thing that had kind of held him back the last couple of seasons because he didn't really play much last season. And then the year before that, right, they got to the playoffs, obviously, and they lost in the first round. And I think that's kind of where you started to kind of feel like, all right, maybe there might be some postseason issues. Now, again, there was some different role players, right? Like obviously you had Dylan Brooks, right, who just couldn't hit a shot in that series. And their bigs, other than Jaren Jackson Jr., weren't really available. But just I think that's kind of just the question of, in the postseason, we've seen Ja have really big games, right? Like, in that Lakers series, they were able to guard him inside, but obviously one of the big things was he was hitting his jump shot in that series. So like when the jumper is falling, right, that just opens up everything for him. And there's like certain aspects driving, right, that maybe aren't quite as developed as maybe some other guards, like the floater package. But I think it's still a work in progress. But I think the thing that helps now is with the offensive growth of everyone else, now he can get into his playmaking, bag and kind of not just be like a dangerous scorer. And not that he was ever a bad passer, but he's really improved on that. And then they haven't needed him to average, and put up the numbers that he was putting up before because their offense is so much better. And I think that's the main thing for them because we know they can defend. It's just about will they be able to kind of get good looks down the floor by the time the playoffs roll around. And I think because, Jaren Jackson Jr., he's improved. Now you just kind of hope and pray that some of those role players do kind of show up, like say like a Santi Aldama. There's going to be games where you'll probably need him, to kind of
Yeah.
heat up and hit some big shots for them, right? Or, even like a Jalen Wells, he's starting for them as a rookie, right? How does that translate, in the postseason? He's even been like a good defensive guy too, right? Because he was the
Agreed.
guy starting Edwards for, most of that game down the stretch, and he limited him pretty much. So I think with Edwards, obviously, with the recency situation, right? He just got to the Western Conference Finals. He's 23. And I think, defensively, he's got more upside. It's not there like every single game, but
Mhm.
obviously his size and his frame is going to help him out on the defensive end. And like you said, he's, been a very consistent 3-point shooter now. So I think that's probably where you're probably higher on it. It's just a matter of the roster construction. It's not good enough, right? Like, and he's not quite at the point where he can just kind of uplift. Like last year's roster, people felt like was clunky, but this one is just different because it just doesn't work, right? You just don't have the same level of flexibility, and it kind of magnifies, I think, some of the flaws offensively that a lot of the players had, which we already knew, but now without Towns, it looks even worse, and that's kind of the problem there, right? Because like if you look at their, per 100 possessions numbers, right, like they're on offense, even worse than last year, right? Like they're basically 21st in offense and then 6th defensively. So it's like, yeah, cool, you're 6th on defense, but they were by far the number 1 defense last year. So now they've taken a step back on both ends of the floor, and that's a problem. And, again, I think they're going to have stretches where they'll win games because they just won 3 in a row, right? This was this was a tough loss against a good team. So, but I think they're just going to be more up and down, right? It's just a matter of, like you said, who do they match up against? What does it look like? But we pretty much know the Wolves are going to be a disappointment this year at this point. We're almost halfway through the season.
Yeah.
And obviously, still a ton of basketball left. You still have over 40 games left, but they're probably not going to be they're not going to be a 50-win team at this point. That's going to be, they won what, 56 games or so last season? So this will easily be like at least a 6, 7, 8 game drop off, which is pretty rough because that's not where you want to be if you're Minnesota. But hey, we'll just kind of have to see what happens, right? Because like Randall, do they bring him back and re-sign him? Like, does he opt into his player option? Do they look to trade him? I just don't really see a version of this roster as currently constructed that's good enough. Whereas with the Grizzlies, I think you have to be higher on them for sure. And people were still kind of high on them going into the season. Just people didn't really know for sure. But I think it's more of a surprise as to how mediocre Minnesota's been than how good Memphis has looked. I think we
Yeah.
expect them to at least be better than last year. They were horrible last year because they were so injury prone, and they've
Yeah.
had injuries this year, but they're starting off with a better base.
Yeah, I think we hinted at them coming back full force anyway. Obviously, I don't think either of us could have predicted how good they would be on both ends of the floor, but we kind of did expect them to be right back in the battle of things, not like, a slow creep back or anything like that.
Yeah, the offense is for sure like the most impressive
Mm-hmm.
growth element for the Grizzlies here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then you kind of look around, at some other, I guess, big matchups. We actually have some that are going on, today, but we'll kind of get into some of the earlier ones. We had Paolo Banchero's return against the Milwaukee Bucks. The Bucks ended up winning the game 109-106, but for Paolo, he comes back and he puts up 34. He gives you 34 and 7 with 2 steals, a block, 5 of 8 from 3. And so, if you're the Magic, even though you lost this game, that's pretty significant that he comes back and he looks, really, really good. And the fact that, you're getting him back, that's your best player. Now you have one of your 2 stars. Obviously, Suggs is out. Franz is still out. So that stinks. But now at least you have like a star level guy that you can put out there, so that way at least your offense should be better than what it was before, because they've been one of the worst offensive teams in the league, right? They've been able to get it done strictly because of their defense, but now at least you have a better offensive floor. And the problem for them is the schedule is so tough. Is like, and so that's the thing that's unfortunate for them is they played the Bucks, but then they're going to play them again a couple days from now. Then they'll also play Boston. They'll also play Denver, right? So then the schedule tapers off after that, right? Raptors, Blazers, Pistons, Heat. But for them, it's kind of a good thing that they've been able to kind of just hang around. Now they've dropped to the 5 seed, right? And they could drop more. But, the fact that they had built up such a cushion by having that stretch that where Franz was winning them games without Paolo, that's big time, right? Because hopefully by the time those guys come back, they're not so far behind that they could make a run and possibly, move back up. Obviously, there's a couple of teams that now they don't have a tiebreaker against, so you'd have to jump over them. But, if they can kind of find a way to stay afloat and not fall into the play-in, well, then that'll be perfectly fine. And then by the time you get into the playoffs, if you get that level of production from your main guys, you might actually be able to, knock off a team. I'm not saying they will, but, at the very least, again, the progression from Paolo and the progression from Franz that we saw, we just got to see if it comes together and both of them can do it. And from Suggs as well, because he's had some really great stretches, before he got hurt. It's been a complete just nightmarish year in terms of guys being able to stay on the floor, because they had other guys in that game that got hurt, right? Like I think KCP got hurt in that game, although I think he's supposed to come back. Jet Howard, I think he hurt his ankle in that game. So, it's been one of those seasons, unfortunately, for them.
Yeah, I think now it's time for Paolo to really kind of, I guess, repay, Franz with the favor, in terms of winning them games while he's out. So, I think he can do it. Clearly, it wasn't like they got blown off the floor or anything like that, against Milwaukee. And like you said, he had a great outing, and I think he's going to pick right up, where he left off. So I think, you're not really too concerned with it. I think they're, like you said, in a good spot to the point where you've given yourself a little bit of a cushion. They have a similar, not, I guess like way of playing to as like Memphis, but they have a way of kind of finding some guys who, might be able to give you some interesting and good performances night in, night out that you probably wouldn't really expect on a regular basis. So I think that's pretty cool. They're sneaky deep, I think, or else, they'd probably have been dropped even further. We're not talking about like a Philadelphia situation. This is completely different. So, I'm not too worried about them, but I think if healthy, they're a very sneaky team that could easily, take somebody to 7 games. So I'm hoping that they do, get healthy and get right back on track.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be the big thing for them is, again, the continued progression of their young guys, and can they just get healthy? I mean, again, last 10 games they're 4-6, but I mean, again, that's without essentially all 3 of their main guys, right? I mean, like, that's pretty reasonable, and they've been able to kind of just randomly every once in a while pick up a win, like pick up a win against the Knicks, and things like that, so just in general, pick up a win against the Celtics, right, a couple weeks ago. So, but once you get to the end of the season, right, that'll be huge, because again, if you don't get wins like that, that's how you end up falling further down. It's just obviously for them, there are teams below them that have now kind of started to kick it into gear, right? Like the Miami Heat have now won 3 in a row, right? That's without Jimmy Butler, right? Obviously, he's been on that suspension. They lost the first couple of games, but since then, they've, been able to kind of win 3 in a row. Hero's been really good. And they're getting contributions from other guys, right? Jovic now, he's, been playing really well. Kel'el Ware. I mean, we don't have to talk, necessarily a ton about them, but just in general, it makes things interesting where, is there a possibility are we at least thinking that maybe there's a possibility that like he might be forced to come back if they can't find a deal? Or are we still kind of in the tier of like, no, he's probably going to be dealt still?
I think too much damage has been done at this point. Bad PR from both sides, clear frustration from both sides as well. And I think, they've both forced each other's hands. So I think he's gone. But I think at the very least you do like that you've seen some extra production from some other guys on the team, because I think we liked certain parts of Miami's roster. We definitely liked the move that they made to draft Kel'el Ware. It's just he wasn't really playing. So from that aspect, I love that he's playing now. And this is kind of where you would normally see, during the season, okay, so and so wasn't playing during the first half or whatever, maybe like the first quarter. All right, well, now that opportunities have been given, it's time for, guys to show up. Like, we were talking about it before we started recording. Like Keon Ellis is now being played. Now Kello Ware. So that's good from that perspective. But I just don't think there's a place for Jimmy on this team anymore. He clearly doesn't want to be there. And Miami clearly doesn't want him. So that I think that era is over. But at least you do have Tyler Hero to move forward with, I guess. Bam is still on the team. Doesn't really seem like anything crazy is going on with that. So,
yeah, and then we're moving on. Pacers and the Pistons. They're turning it up now. I mean, to be fair, the Pistons have been, for most of the season, good anyways. But, obviously with the Pacers, they were really struggling, to begin the season. And now they've won 5 in a row, 7-3 in their last 10, right? You've gotten, consistently much better production from Tyrese Halliburton. And that's, kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about, right? Where earlier in the season, he just wasn't playing that well. And now that you're getting, these much better performances out of him, I mean, that, not that that's the only thing, but obviously it's a huge part of it, just because of the fact that, that's your star, that's your guy. So, that's the guy that I think you're kind of hoping and praying, that if he can kind of get right and kind of figure things out, then all of a sudden, right, then you got a much better shot, to kind of get things done, right? In the month of January, through 5 games, right, he's giving you 25 points, 11 assists, 55 from the field, 49 from 3, right? I mean, that's what you want. And obviously it's a small-ish sample size. But even in the month of December, right, he was giving you 18 and 9, right? 47 from the field, 35 from 3. So it feels like he's rounding out to form. Obviously you got Mathurin, and Siakam and everyone else. And again, they've been without, Aaron Nesmith. He's kind of been in some trade rumors as of late. Obviously, Thomas Bryant now has become the backup big. Good production from Jarvis Walker. So, again, if you're the Pacers now, you're starting to play well at the right time, because now, as some of these other teams, have been a little bit more up and down, the Pacers have been consistently good, and now they are kind of right there in terms of, like, they still have some work to do to get out of the play-in, but they're right there with everyone else now compared to, the disaster it was starting to look like earlier in the season. And I think we still believed in Halliburton. I don't think we just thought that he was just done and just not having a great. I think the big thing we talked about was it seemed like he was dealing with some injuries. Now it seems like he's healthy, and now you're getting much closer to a version that I think we were hoping and anticipating to see.
yeah, when you have the injury history that he's had over the past year, he never really got a true break, a full off season, because he was dealing, with Team USA and that camp, but then also got hurt there. So, you kind of, I didn't really think about it until it started happening. That, yeah, he was probably going to have a very, very slow start to the season. And then obviously a very slow ramp up, which is kind of a good thing, I guess, now. Obviously you would have wanted, him to be fully healthy going into the season and giving you the production, but he's inching closer and closer back to what we saw, last year, at least for the good part of last year. So that's a great sign. And it all starts at the top for a team that's constructed like Indiana, where, if Halliburton's not playing well, then you're probably going to have a worse season as a team.
Yeah. And then the Pistons, we've talked about them, where Cade Cunningham continues to impress and amaze, and I think is pretty much now kind of put to bed the questions and concerns that, some people may have had about, his viability as an actual franchise guy. I think for people who may have doubted it, right, maybe they just didn't see it. I thought that I never sold the stock on him. Obviously, it was just kind of wild how bad Detroit was last season, and it's not necessarily his fault. But I think now that you see that they've put better pieces around him, they've got some veterans, guys like Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., Tobias Harris. So those are guys that can shoot the basketball. And unfortunately, obviously, they lost Ivy with that leg injury. But regardless, just as a whole, I mean, it's like this team is now fun to watch. They're much better than they were last year. Now they're above 500, 8-2 in their last 10. And we'll see how it finishes. But they might actually be on their way to a play-in. appearance. And even if they fall just short of it, this is a successful season, I think, if you're the Pistons, because it starts with Cade. Now you've kind of known this is like what, year one or whatever of his extension. Now you see he's a franchise guy. Now it's just a matter of continuing to build and see whether or not maybe they end up buying in, at the deadline.
Yeah, I've been thoroughly impressed with his play, and it's funny because I was one of those people that wasn't too sure if he could really carry the load of being a franchise player. Like I thought he would be good, but not great. You know what I mean? And
Right.
looking at it in hindsight, yeah, it's amazing to see what he's been able to produce. Because I think what it was for me the second year, I think that was the year when he got hurt. I wasn't too sure, and then coming off the injury, he looked good, but the team was garbage. And I was like, well, it's year 3. I don't know. But now being in year 4, yeah, he looks amazing. The efficiency obviously is the big key, but also the way that he gets to his spots effortlessly
Mm-hmm.
at that height and can also play make. It's scary good. So I think, he's not even close to probably, reaching his peak yet. So I think he's got a long way to go in a lot of facets of his game. And I think that's the really cool part about Detroit. You definitely have that. And then obviously your other guys like Asor Thompson has been sneaky underrated this year. I think we already know what he can do defensively, but if he continues to potentially, get that offense together, that's going to be a big help for them. And then obviously their other pieces, Jalen Duren looking pretty solid as well. So, overall Detroit, yeah, they've got some guys that can really hoop, and then couple that with putting those veterans around the guy. It's a serious squad now.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the thing that you wanted to see from the Pistons, is just a much more serious team. JB Bickerstaff, right, as the coach, he's kind of
Hmm.
also kind of helped, again, make this a much more respectable group. And I think
Hmm.
that's what you were hoping for if you're the Pistons and if you're a Pistons fan. So now you have a team that you can root for, right? Where now you where like you're actually upset like when they lose. Not that they weren't upset before, but it was almost like you were expecting it. But now, when you lose, you're upset because you feel like we're not supposed to lose this game, right? Like, they lost a game a few nights ago to Golden State, and I'm sure some Pistons fans were like, "How did we lose?" They were mad that they lost the game, right? Because they're trying to get into the play-in. They want to see this team, have a have some run and get some experience. So hopefully they can get that. Obviously, we'll see, what the East kind of looks like by the end of it, right? Because you have the Sixers that are still hanging around in that 11 spot. They are
Hmm.
6-4 in the last 10,
Hmm.
but it feels like this is the problem that we talked about, where because they started the season off so poorly, now they're kind of in that tier of like they need to kind of go on a run. Like it can't just be 6-4. You got to start winning like maybe 8 out of 10, 9 out of 12, and game, in stretches like that, because again, as I mentioned, right, teams like the Pistons and the Pacers, they're 7-3, or excuse me, 8-2, 7-3. The Hawks and the Bulls have been kind of 500, but they have been able to pick up some wins that have been, where they kind of are able to still stay ahead of Philly. And like Chicago could probably finish as like a 10 spot if they don't make any moves. I mean, because like for them, they haven't done anything, right? In terms of they haven't moved on from Vucevic or Levine. Both guys are playing very well. So, for Philly, that's kind of a tough spot to be in. Not saying that they can't get in. And then obviously you have, the issues of guys still not playing consistently or just being hurt. And it just continues to be a nightmare season for them, which I think a while ago we kind of pretty much put to bed the idea that they were going to probably have like a successful season, at all. I mean, just because of the fact that it's so difficult to start off that point. And they had some big win, like they had the big win over Boston on Christmas, but it's just we only see flashes. We just don't see enough consistency, I don't think, to
Yeah.
really take them seriously, in
Yeah.
my opinion.
Yeah. Their big three does not play together. And when they have, it's been mid at best. And I think the highlight of their season was not signing Paul George. I think it's been Yabusele. I think he's been, the best acquisition that they've made. And I think that speaks volumes as to, what kind of season they've had, and, the lack of impact that the big three has had. And, I mean, what did you really expect? That's what I would say to people who, had them as like favored to win the finals and go to the playoffs and stuff like that. Yeah, no shot. I just never believed, because you have a duo of guys that can't really stay healthy. And then you want to put them together. I don't think so. And Maxi's been pretty good too, but outside of that, it's just like there's not a lot of big takeaways from this season because we haven't seen anything.
Yeah. And then, last but not least, the Sacramento Kings have a pulse. They're actually alive. They've won 6 in a row, including several games without De'Aaron, including like at least 3 games without De'Aaron Fox. He just came back against the Bulls. But wow, it's kind of wild, right? Like they fired Mike Brown, and obviously there was, a pretty significant uproar, from other coaches around the league and I think, the biggest problem was how it happened, right? Like, basically like the idea of they fired him before he even got on the plane, right? Like it just seemed kind of unprofessional. But if you're gonna fire a coach, you better start winning games. And now they're winning games, and Keon Ellis, right? He's been getting minutes. He's not starting now that Fox is back, but he played well in those games on both ends of the floor. And another guy, right, who has come back from an injury where he didn't play to begin the season, and we talked about how whether or not he could realistically make a difference, and we just didn't really know, didn't think so, but he clearly has. Devin Carter, right? He's come back and he's kind of shown what he kind of, some of the pros of his game in college, right? Where his athleticism, his defense, his rebounding, he's even hit a few jumpers here and there. So, now you watch the team, they're playing faster, playing at a pace that I think makes a lot more sense given the type of talent on the roster. So, again, what does the season look like in terms of success for them? I don't really know, but at least now they look significantly better than they did before, where it looked like an absolute disaster. And, now they're in that playing mix again, where they're, in the 9 spot right ahead of Golden State, because right now they have the tiebreaker. Again, we'll see if they can actually get in, and actually get out of the play-in and, find a way into the playoffs. But, at least for now, it does seem like they are, playing better. And also Sabonis has been playing great. Against they've got a game against the Celtics where he basically almost gave them a 30-20 game. Or 30-30 game almost. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah, it is crazy, but I'm gonna be real. I'm not bored in the hype train. I think this is probably gonna dissipate as quickly as it, appeared. I just don't think this has a lot of longevity, and that's not to discredit everything that they've done and the adjustments that they've made, because I think having a guy like Devin Carter in your rotation is awesome. That's why he was my sleeper pick in the draft. Like I thought he was like a hidden gem. But I think they need to do a couple more things. I think they do need to make some moves at the trade deadline. Like I would probably be looking for them to trade Trey Lyles and Kevin Huerter away, maybe get some better rotational pieces like that. Because I think the only way that they're going to possibly get out of the play-in or into the playoffs is if all 3 of their big 3 play well, night in, night out, and Keegan Murray turns the corner as well, and nobody's play can taper off. Like not saying that they can't have a bad night, but collectively they just cannot run into slumps, and I just don't think that that's gonna happen. Like I think they're bound to taper off at some point.
Well, that's kind of what we talked about. Like just when you start off poorly to begin the season, it's just very difficult to be able to kind of go on runs over the course of the season where you win. Again, like 7 out of 10 and things. Not that it's I mean, they've already won 6 in a row, but that's the problem, is that you have to keep it up. And you've already kind of put yourself, in a little bit of a hole. I mean, again, they're a couple games back of, 5 and 6. So yeah, with some wins, but then the problem is some of those teams that they lost to, during the stretch where they were bad, like say the Lakers have the tiebreaker over the Kings, right? They beat them 4 times, and that was during the stretch where the Kings looked like more of a mess. So they got to finish with a better record than them. And I'm not saying they can't. I'm just saying that's the tough part of starting off the season so poorly, is the fact that now you have to make up for it in the latter parts. And the thing is, if you get, this is the time of the season where if you do get more high energy, effort level games, you can win. Just because there are going to be some teams that, are kind of now in the mode of like, all right, we know we're not that great. And then, some other teams that are kind of just stuck in the mud, stuck in the middle. But yeah, that's kind of I think the main question is it actually sustainable? The offense in theory should be, just because of the fact that you have a number of good offensive players. It's just a matter of, can those guys, like Keon Ellis and Devin Carter bring it on the defensive end? Because if they weren't, then that and that's kind of the issue that like a Keegan Murray was in, where he's like the only defensive guy, in that rotation. And then obviously Fox is gonna, need to get back to being healthy, right? Because he had
True.
missed a few games, with a glute injury, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously he's gonna probably need a little bit of time to get into it. I still don't necessarily feel like there's like a situation where it's like if Fox is looking at it long term, I don't really see that there's like a situation where he's like, oh, now I want to stay, unless he gets like All NBA and then he gets that big max extension that he signs, and then at least maybe for like a season he'll be there. But if I'm him, I just don't really see like a real future with this team, just from the perspective of there's not a version of this team to me that probably goes much further than, what they peaked as before, the first round. Just I don't really see it with that group. But
I agree.
in theory, at least it looks better than it did before. And at least like now the Kings fans, I feel like, probably feel better about the team, because it wasn't just that they were bad at home. They were, losing games left and right. Even their offense really didn't look all that good. And then people were clamoring for the minutes. And it's just kind of bizarre, right? Just from that perspective, because he played last season a decent amount, especially, by the end of it, right? I mean, but just for whatever reason, his minutes were kind of up and down. And that was kind of odd. But, it's just, I don't know. It just a lot of times it just feels, you just don't really feel like things like that usually kind of all of a sudden spark that much of a difference. But like you said, it could be a flash in the pan, and that's why you still have to wait for a bigger sample size, because you could move 3 weeks from now and then it kind of just goes back to looking kind of again, which not saying it will, but it certainly could. That's the thing with these sample sizes and these stretches of the season. Does it look good enough that they can be in the mix at the very, because again, there's more than 10 teams that are going to try to compete for a playoff spot, right? Like the Suns, even with the situation they've been in, and now they've kind of won a couple of games, with Beal coming off the bench, but like obviously they're still going to look to try to make the playoffs. The Spurs presumably are going to look to try to get into the playoffs. So, can they stay ahead of those teams? And they're still probably going to have to leapfrog a couple of teams.
Yeah.
So, we'll see what happens. But obviously, at least it's a better situation than it looked like before.
Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm. Now, for this last one, before we get into the news and rumors, we are kind of now into, this fan update situation, right? So with the All-Star game, we're going to have another one, and we'll probably get into that, once we record our next episode, later in the week. But, just kind of wild just to kind of look at the fan returns for the All-Star game, because in the West, you look at the front court, you got Jokic, you got Durant and LeBron as your top three. Then after that, you got Wemby, you got AD, you got Şengün. For guards, in the first fan return, Steph was third. He was behind both SGA and Luka. Now he's moved ahead of Luka, which, because Luka hasn't played, that's obviously been a big factor, as he continues to be out. And, maybe we'll have an update on him in a couple weeks or so. But, keep in mind, the All-Star game is in San Francisco. So I'd have a hard time feeling like he's not going to be, in that starting group with the guards. As long as he's in, one or two, then he'll be fine, because he'll probably have enough everywhere else regardless. So that it was looking kind of weird, but at least that seems like it's gotten fixed. And then in the East, right, you got Giannis, Tatum. Now Towns is third in the front court, obviously with the Knicks fans. Paolo is fourth, interestingly enough, even though he has only played in like 6 games. He's ahead of guys like Jaylen Brown, Butler, Franz, Mobley, Embiid, wildly, right? Because he was, generally speaking, always in that top 3 or 4 in the East. But, in fairness, he hadn't played that much.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the East for the guards, LaMelo Ball is number 1 in guards, which is interesting. And then, we know he's a popular player, especially, in the social media online circles, right? He's a very viral player.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got Mitchell, you got Lillard, you got Brunson. So what do you think of this? This is kind of a different list than I think maybe we might be accustomed to. Because there are guys that are there that I think we kind of expect, but then also some other guys where you're like, oh wow.
I mean, it's the fans. That's what I'll say.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, this isn't going to be the set in stone list, but for a fan vote, I mean, it kind of makes sense. There are some names up here that do make sense. Like, I think LaMelo, the record of the team is horrible. But at the
Right.
end of the day, I think he's been having a pretty solid season. He's averaging 30 points. So it's not like, he's playing bad or anything like that. He's really been out of his mind. I guess maybe not as efficient as you would like, but still, night in, night out, he's giving you pretty solid plays. It's just, health and that record is abysmal. So I doubt he, is going to be a starter. But I think Donovan Mitchell, Damian Lillard, Jalen Brunson, those are kind of running the mill, and like the depth at that guard spot
Yeah.
for the Eastern Conference is scary. Like it's tough. Like there's some guys that probably won't make it that deserve to make it. Like I think Tyler Hero deserves to make it, but he probably won't be getting in there just because the saturation. There's too many guys that are playing better than him, even though he's having a really good season. Like Trae Young, Brunson. Yeah, like it's
Garland.
Garland.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
Garland's got to be there.
Yeah, and that's the tough. And obviously, we'll probably within the next couple of weeks or so do our All-Star, list and whatnot. But yeah, that's kind of like you said. That's the cool part, or the wild part is there's so much talent here. Like you said, there are going to be guys where you're going to be like, how is this guy not an All-Star? And in fairness, we'll probably have some injury replacements. Because that always happens every year. Unfortunately, hopefully it's not somebody that's playing right now, but knock on wood. But just in general, that always happens. So there will be more guys that will be named All-Stars, even if they don't play. But just as a whole, yeah, it's just kind of and like you said, like there's always some funny situations here, right? Like where it's like, a guy that probably shouldn't be an All-Star or in the All-Star conversation is on here. Yeah, like you said, that's always the fan return. I think it's just more so just there are some guys that were generally high fixtures on these lists that have moved so far down. I think that's kind of the main thing that's a little bit more surprising, than usual, right? Just like, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of the main thing.
Yeah.
Like Embiid usually has been somewhere like in the top 5 in the front court, right? Like usually, I mean, like top three.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, like top 3, but he's almost all the way down at the bottom. I mean, he's lower than Evan Mobley, right? And Evan Mobley, like, obviously he's had a great season, but just like in terms of the fan stuff, like, just that doesn't normally happen. You know what I mean? Like that's not what you normally see. But for a lot of them, yeah, you're right. It's not too surprising. And then SGA getting the most guard votes, I think, is kind of interesting to me, right? Just because of the fact that it's not Luka, right, who had already kind of built up a fan base for a while. Not that SGA hadn't, but obviously with OKC being by far the number 1 team in the West, that's helped. And then obviously for Steph, right? Again, this is going to be a scenario where, like we mentioned with LeBron last season, right, where if you were doing it based off of like quote unquote performance, right, you probably wouldn't have had LeBron starting in the All-Star game, but obviously he was going to, right, because he's still really good, and that's just what's going to happen, right? Like that's what's going to happen for Steph. He's going to start, even though you could probably make the case that there's been a couple of guards that have been better this season, but it's San Francisco, right? That's I mean, he's basically a king there at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, and like he's gonna still be there because he's still playing well. Like it's not like he's playing horrible. But it's just it's just kind of wild to look at this list and you can kind of see, some of these younger players are starting to kind of move up. Like Wemby, right, was not on this list, I don't think at all last season, even though he was good. But now he's moved ahead of some of these other guys, or he's right there with him. Like he's not that far behind LeBron.
Yep.
He's ahead of AD. And obviously it will change, right? Because we'll have another one, I think, because the last day is the 20th of January. So the 16th is the last update, and we'll talk about that. But always kind of fun to look at this.
Yeah, I think it's awesome to look at it because I think it kind of gives you a gauge about, who's hot and who's not in the NBA in terms of, the names and talent and stuff like that. So, yeah, and you always get these teams and players that have, some very cult-like fan bases, like I guess Norman Powell's like play is pretty solid, but does he deserve to be top 10 in the Western Conference for guards? I don't know. You could make a case, I'm sure, if you're a Clippers fan. Like his numbers have been pretty freaking good, but
yeah,
it's just funny things like that always get me in these fan returns.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts, on all of these teams that we've kind of been talking about, these matchups, as we get closer and closer to the halfway point of the season, right? We're almost at that point where we have, I think, a much more established view of a lot of these teams and where they're probably headed, which teams need to do something. And of course, we're going to be, a month or so away from the All-Star game and the trade deadline. So those are always fun events to discuss too. So just let us know everything. And again, we appreciate all the support. Continue to like, comment, and subscribe. If you leave a comment, we'll read it at the beginning of the video. See you next episode.